Hello, hello, and welcome to UMedia Chicago's Speak On It, a series of author talks virtually connecting successful writers in conversation about books, writing, creativity, and more. I am Alex, your friendly neighborhood teen librarian, and I am so excited to welcome our guest today, Elana K. Arnold. Elana, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. I love Chicago. I wish I were there physically, but
Yeah,
this
it's a
is
beautiful
great too.
city. Yay! So a little bit about Elana. Elana is the author of critically acclaimed and award-winning young adult novels and children's books, including her latest picture book, An Ordinary Day, which is so beautiful. Elana, it made me cry. And her latest young adult novel, Red Hood, which we're going to be talking about today. And her books have appeared on many best of lists, including the Chicago Public Library Best of the Best list several times. And for those who are watching live, we want your questions too. So if you have any questions for Elana, put them in the chat and we will ask them. So yay. So Elana, let's start at the beginning. When did you start writing?
Oh, I should have pulled it out. I meant to. I was a kid. I was little when I started writing. I don't know, probably 6 or 7. I don't remember a time before writing. I wrote all the time. I wrote poems when I was little, and I wrote songs, and I wrote little short stories, and I wrote the beginnings of many, many novels, the first 2 or 3 pages. And I wrote journal entries that always felt weird to me because I always knew I was writing for an audience, and so it felt so disingenuous to me to, even as a kid, I remember trying to write, for posterity in my diary. And then I didn't write, though. I quit writing for a long time after I got my master's degree. There was about 10 years where I didn't write very much at all I considered it to be a great failure for about the first 7 years. And then finally I decided, forget it. I'm not a writer, I'm a reader. And I became a voracious reader like I used to read when I was a kid. And of course, what that did was it made me want to write again. I read indiscriminately and widely, and as opposed to just reading the sorts of books I felt I should be reading, because I should be writing books like those, which had narrowed my worldview to books, by people very much like myself, except with a penis. And so so broadening the world again and reading broadly, just because I wanted to, really brought me back to being a writer. That was a long answer.
No, that's amazing. I love it. Did you got your MFA? It wasn't an MFA, it was your master's?
It's actually, I wish it were an MFA. Here's a little tip for kids. It's an MA in English with an emphasis in creative writing. It's exactly the same as an MFA. We did all the same coursework plus a few extra PhD level, classes. And it was fully funded like an MFA, which was great. Like some MFAs, like in residency MFAs where you were a teaching assistant. But it's not a terminal degree. It's not considered a terminal degree, so it made it harder to find teaching jobs at the university level, because it's just like this technicality. Now it's an MFA. The program I went to has now become an MFA. So I keep meaning to petition them to see if I can sort of posthumously change my degree title.
Yeah.
Basically, I have an MFA, but without the F.
That's interesting. Academics is so weird.
Academics is really weird.
Yeah, that stuff is all. Okay, so we've already got some viewer questions. So what is your favorite childhood book?
I brought some books. This is the beauty of these in-person things, from home, because I have my bookshelf. So this was one of my very favorite first books, Big Macs. I love this book by Kim Platt. It's an I Can Read mystery with clues to the plot by Robert Lopshire. So apparently the author couldn't come up with his own clues. I think that's pretty great. And you can see that I love this book so much that, I don't know if you can see the pencil lines, but I decorated in it because I just loved it so much. I just wanted to be part of it. Here I drew the ship that he takes off from, and I decorated around him with his umbrella. I just had to insert myself into the book, which I think is actually kind of a great metaphor for how you learn to write, as you sort of take the things you love and then add yourself to them. I loved Harriet the Spy. I identified with Harriet. She's wearing a red sweatshirt, actually, with a hood.
She is.
So there you go.
Yeah.
And then I really loved this book by Stephen King, The Eyes of the Dragon. I discovered this as a teen reader. Stephen King is an American treasure as a writer, in my opinion. And one thing I love about Stephen King is that he writes whatever he wants in all different genres, all different categories. And this is his Arthurian legend. It's wonderful. It's a fairy tale. And it very much, I think, was an inspiration for Damsel, my fairy tale. And it's just a beautiful book. I really recommend this book. So those are some of my, it's got great illustrations too. And some of the characters who return in some of his later books originate, I think, in this book. So one thing I noticed, which I just noticed just now, was that the font that's used here, like look at the E there and the D, are very similar to the font that they used for Red Hood, which I didn't know until just now when I pulled this book off my shelf. I haven't pulled it off in years. I was so excited to see that. So anyway, those are some of my favorite books from when I was a kid.
That's so interesting. I did not know that Stephen King ever wrote anything like that. So
yeah,
I'll have to check that out.
If he's written so many books. Some of them I don't like at all. Some of them I'm like, oh, but some of them I absolutely love.
Love it. Fabulous. Which sort of answers my question of what were some of the authors that you read when you were young? Were there authors that you like followed or?
Definitely. I was a huge fan of John Irving. Basically, I read the things on my dad's bookshelf as a kid, as a young teenager. So I read the vampire books, the Vampire Lestat, those books by Anne, what's her name? Anne Rice. But I also read her dirty spin-offs under Anne Rampling. She wrote one called Belinda. And then there's Anne Roclet, which was her even more racy book. She wrote the Claiming of Sleeping Beauty trilogy. I read those when I was like 14 or 15. They're pretty dark stuff. I loved, all of John Irving, especially A Prayer for Owen Meany. I read that book over and over and over again. I read a bunch of Stephen King. You might be sensing a theme here. I read a lot of white men. That's what my dad bought, and that's what I read. And then I didn't realize how much fantasy I really read as a kid and science fiction, but I think it was because my dad bought. I read a lot of Fitzgerald and Hemingway. In graduate school, I did sort of an extended Hemingway study. So those were some of my biggest influences as a younger writer.
Interesting. Yeah, lots of, I find like same looking back at school, I read so many just like white men.
Yeah.
Like that's what was around. So that's
I read a lot of other stuff too, but those were the books that I felt like I was reading literature when I picked up one of those books. I think it's kind of sad. Yeah. It's probably why it took me so long to find a voice of my own. Yeah. They're great books though. I'm not saying they're not, I think not all of them. Some of them weren't great, but a lot of them were really great books. They're just not the only sort of great.
Yeah. So you also write for a wide variety of ages. You got picture books and middle grade and YA. Is your writing process like approach different for different ages, or is it kind of the same?
It's really not. For me, story is story, and children are whole people already. And so my job is to tell the best story I can. I don't ever really set out to write a story that teaches a lesson. I don't do that. Not at all. I just try to tell a really good story. And I don't ask myself what it means or who it's for. It's pretty clear early on though, because I know that if I'm writing a book about a 13-year-old, unless it's an adult novel, it's probably going to be read by 11 to 13-year-olds or 10 to 13-year-olds. And so it becomes a middle grade novel. But I don't consciously adjust my voice or what lessons or what sorts of stories I should tell in those spaces, sometimes to my detriment. My first 2 middle grade novels, I think they were widely loved by adult librarians, but they both made people feel a little uncomfortable, and so they weren't necessarily shared as widely as my later middle grade novels, which made the grown-ups feel more comfortable. I think they're just as good, but I try to remind myself that it's none of my business who reads my books. It's my business to write the best stories I can. And then it's someone else's job to decide, where to shelve them, or if to shelve them, or if to buy them, even as a librarian or as a publisher. So I guess with picture book, I know I'm writing a picture book because that feels more like writing a poem though to me. Again, I don't try to spare the child, but if you've read An Ordinary Day, you know that much. That's it's kind of heartbreaking, but life is beautiful and also heartbreaking. And so I think that's, if there's any commonality in my books, maybe that's one of them. Beauty and heartbreak.
But I think that kids and teens appreciate that. Like I remember as a teen feeling like I just want people to tell me the truth,
Yeah, me
and
too,
this
for
this
sure.
idea that we have that they like can't handle it, and
Yeah,
they can.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I
And
think
that
so.
kind of yeah,
Yeah,
that kind of dovetails into another viewer
yeah,
question, which is also about your process. So
yeah.
Grace asks, what are some of the key aspects of your writing process, and like the highlights of your process?
Hi, Grace. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Um, it's different depending on where I am in the process. So if I'm generating ideas and I'm trying to start something new, I basically have to wait until something hits me to start. And it's usually it's almost always a character or a plot idea, is what I come up with first. And if I have one, or sometimes it's a setting. I wrote a book called The Question of Miracles, which was my first middle grade novel, and I just knew where it was going to be set before I knew anything else. I feel if I have one of those things, a character, a plot, or a setting, I don't have to know everything about it even. I have enough. I have a door into the story, and the other two doors will open as I go. And then I just really, really, really try to write every day when I'm writing. I don't write every day my whole life. It's been about 2 weeks now since I've written. But when I am writing, I try to at least touch my book every day. I think that's good advice. Even if you don't have time to write or you don't have the will to write, touch it. Like, open the file, open the notebook, physically put your hand on it, read a few lines, remind yourself it's a living thing, every single day. Like, every day, as much as you can. If you skip a day, it's like with taking antibiotics, you don't throw the whole thing away because you missed one course. You just pick up where you left off the next day and keep going. So
I love that.
That's, a big important part of my process. And you don't hate yourself and beat yourself up and tell yourself you're a terrible person for forgetting to take one of your antibiotic pills, right? You just say, oops, I forgot. I'm going to pick it up. I'm going to take it today and keep going forward. So that's, how I feel about writing. It's best not to shame yourself. If you attach shame to writing, you're not going to want to write. It's also best, I think, not to turn it into something so precious that it can only occur under very specific circumstances, because then that limits the amount of opportunities you have to be creative. So try to touch your work I try to touch my work every day, and I try to make forward progress. I like to set myself a word goal. Now at this point in my writing career, I didn't used to. It would have been too overwhelming. But now I very much want to get to the end. I love finishing. I love finishing things. It's my most favorite feeling. And I want you guys to finish things. It's the most satisfying feeling, and most young writers don't get to experience that feeling of satisfaction, because they don't finish. They get bored, or they get distracted, or they get scared, and they start something new, and then they don't get to feel that satisfaction. So I very much encourage people to practice finishing. And I really don't believe you can revise until you finish. So I don't revise a draft. Like, I might have some ideas for how I need to revise it, but I'll open up another document and I'll stash my ideas there. And then I'll just keep going forward to the end. This is trademarked Elana K. Arnold, what I'm about to say, but you're welcome to quote me on it. Imagine, right, that you have a cat in your arms and you spend 2 years petting that lovely cat. And then one day you look down and you realize you're holding a dead cat. For 2 years, you've been petting a dead cat. Oh my God, isn't that awful? Like, that's what it is if you continue to chew and machinate on the first 3 chapters of the book that you never finished. Because it's possible you get to the end, you cut those first 3 chapters, you never even needed them. So I like to remind myself and others not to pet the dead cat.
I love that. I love that analogy.
I love cats. Don't want to pet a dead one.
No dead cats. I'm very, that'd be, we have a couple more viewer questions.
Oh, good.
So Marcus asks, how do movies and other visual media influence your writing? Does it get in the way, or do you embrace those influences?
I really love TV lately, more than anything. There's so much good TV. I used to be I also watch movies too. I don't think that they badly influence. I think I think of creative people, our job is to pay attention and to look around, and we take in, and then we turn it into something new. That's our job. Not new, but uniquely ours. First of all, give up the idea of new and give up the idea of original. Go for sincere. Go for honest. So I think there's no problem with taking in other media forms if they feel good to you to take in. And each project sort of demands you to take in different things. I think. Sometimes some books tell you to stay away from everything like it when you're writing it, and you just want to read something different or watch things that are very different. Sometimes you want to really immerse yourself in dark things if you're writing in a dark book. And I think, listen, and don't ask why too much, and don't tell yourself you're wrong. I really have a core belief that you have a back of your brain that does a lot of the generative work of drafting and of creating, and that if you let yourself tell it, no, why, don't do that, you're wrong, it'll stop offering its brilliance to the front of your brain. So I really think my job as a writer, when I'm writing, is to say yes and open the door and add more. Yes, I want to watch that movie, and I'm interested in watching everything else that actor starred in, because something about him, I don't know what it is, but what you're doing is you're seeding the back of your brain, and you're giving yourself material that you're going to change, because you're your machine is going to do something different with all that than anybody else's machine, and you're going to take in your own mishmash. If it's your nature walk that you go on plus a movie, it's going to be different than someone else's swim that they do and the same movie and their own lived experiences. So say yes and don't deny yourself pleasures.
I love that. Let's see. Okay. So we're going to talk a little specifically about Red Hood.
Yes.
So yay, which I loved so much.
Thank you.
Would you mind pitching it for us? Giving us
I love to pitch this book. Some books are really fun to pitch. Some books are harder. Once I was at a round table with What Girls Are Made Of, and I was supposed to pitch it, but it was like supposed to be this really fun, upbeat thing. I was like, well, and I was paired with this other writer who'd written a really fun rom-com. It sounded great. Her book sounded great. Like I would have bought her book 100 times before I bought my book. But this book pitches well. So about 4 years ago, I was ice skating in Yosemite in an outdoor skating rink, surrounded by this ring of fir trees. And above me was a full moon. And it was cold and wintry, and I had just begun my period. And I thought to myself, oh, that's interesting. Werewolves cycle with moons. Menstruators cycle with moons. What if there were a menstruator who, when her period begins, at a very inopportune moment, finds that with her blood comes the ability to hunt werewolves? Some ideas hit you, and you just know you had a brilliant idea. And so I did what writers do, is I rushed back to my hotel room, and I immediately started Googling werewolves, periods, hunters, and I was sure it had to exist in the world already. And when I found it didn't yet exist, I was compelled to write this book. I had such exciting, forward-moving energy to tell the story of Bisou Martel, who at the age of 16 begins to menstruate, and indeed finds that in the woods outside of Seattle, it's a contemporary story, there are dangers that she is uniquely primed to interact with. And it's a retelling of Red Riding Hood, but it's also a very modern story about rape culture and incels and agency. How was that?
Yes, that's great.
Hey, I pitched it.
That's fantastic. Yes. I feel like when I first read it also gave me a little bit of Buffy vibes. It was like if Buffy...
Yeah, I never watched Buffy. but I grew up with Buffy. I watched a few episodes here and there. I think it does. I think so too. I was definitely in my stew of the woman I was becoming as a teenager. And so whatever you're growing up with culturally is going to, I think, feed into what you write, whether or not you actually were a big fan of it or not. I liked the episodes I saw, but I don't know if I was never home the night that came on. And back then you had to watch the show when it came out.
Yeah.
I saw it here and there, but I don't really, I wasn't a big follower, but definitely.
Yeah. And I didn't watch it when it was airing, but I've watched it recently. And so maybe that also it's, it's like.
Yeah, absolutely.
On my brain.
Yeah.
And so this one, in some of your previous books, you've incorporated myths and stories into kind of woven into the narrative, but this one's actually a retelling of stories. Was it different to do that?
Yeah, it was in some ways easier. And I recommend, if you're having a hard time coming up with a whole plot, I recommend borrowing a plot that's already written that you like. It'll be different through you than it was on its own. It's okay to do that. And so in that way, it was sort of easier because I knew that there would be a grandmother. I knew there would be a big bad wolf. In my story, there's other wolves. I knew there would be grandmother's house. I knew there would be a showdown. I knew there'd be an axe. But how those things were going to be used was going to be me. So that made it interestingly easy. It was harder in making it work. So this book was a really fun book to draft, and it took a lot of work. I put more revision work into Red Hood than any other book I've written so far, before or since. It was a bear of a revise. It went through like, I think maybe 8 pretty deep revisions where the third act was changed, and where I like took out plot threads and then tried a different one to make them end up where they end up at the end in a way that felt satisfying and believable. So that was rough. But it was a fun challenge. I really liked it.
Fun. And so much of it is in second person too,
Yeah.
which is also, if people aren't familiar, rather than being in first person, which is like I went, I did, or third person, like she went, she did, it's you. So it's you walk down the stairs, you go into it. How is that? How did you do that, Elana? Tell us how you
know, that's a great question. So when I first decided to do it, I didn't ask why. I really don't think you should ask the back of your brain why it wants to do something. I simply said, okay, and the whole book will be told that way. Except for the section where a different character speaks to the main character. And so it's a different kind of you then. That character says, I did this and you should know. So you're listening to, very personal. So, but in retrospect, with some distance, I now can see why. I think I know why I did it. I think that point of view, I really wanted the reader to feel the point of view. So let's think about cliches and what cliches are. So a cliche is an overused expression, right? Like my heart broke. But the thing about a cliche is that they're usually wonderful expressions. That's how they got overused, right? Is that they are so evocative. Like my heart broke. Like when you hear that now, you say, but stop, like force your brain to picture a heart breaking. That's a beautiful metaphor. And if you heard it for the first time, it would trigger you to think that image, right? If you're an imagistic thinker. But over time, we don't notice it anymore because it became shorthand for something else. And I think that's how first person works. When people started writing in first person and first person present, which I write in a lot, it forced you to recognize the immediacy of the story because it was fresh and different than third person or first person past. But over time, we've gotten kind of used to it as readers. And so we don't notice the perspective anymore. We don't really realize how much we are the character. This I voice is so personal. And so when I made this you, it was sort of a way of forcing the reader to notice their participation in the story. And in this story, I really wanted the reader to feel very present, in part because this character does wonderfully violent things that I've never done and wish I had in some ways,
Yep.
At least symbolically. And so it feels, again, satisfying to me to be in the you voice when Bizou does some of the things she does. And I wanted the reader to have that satisfaction.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Love that. Okay, another viewer question from Ray, I think, is how you say that. Do you have any tips on deciding what input from others to take in and what to set aside? It's a great question.
Oh, I have so much to say about all of these things. So much wisdom. Yes, I do. It's different for every person. What works for me is what I can tell you. So when I'm writing a book, I do want readers as I go, less than lately, but especially for my first few books, I wanted someone to care, but I really didn't want them to tell me what to change. And I have 2 sisters, both of whom knew without me telling them, and that's the trick, that their job was to say, it's great, where's the next chapter? That's all I wanted. I wanted someone to say, it's great, oh my God, I can't wait to find out what happens next. When are you gonna give me the next chapter? So I had an eager, excited reader. I did not want them to tell me this character really feels inconsistent, or I didn't really believe the dialogue on pages 7 through 14. I really think you need to take another look at that. I did not want that. And if they had said those things, I would have stopped sending it, and maybe I would have stopped writing. That's what worked for me, was I wanted a reader, just 1 or 2 who cared, to report back to me that they still cared. That's all I wanted. So I'm not a big fan of workshopping works in progress, even though I teach at a program in which we workshop works in progress, but that's the nature of the programs. We have to teach you how to write and how to revise at the same time because we only have 2 years. And so but in an ideal world, I think writing is for me, it's a very private thing. I write the book I want to write. I sort it all out. I tell the back of my brain, yes, and this is a safe space. There's no one here to tell me that I've messed up or that I've done something terribly offensive even. I'm just at home playing and working. Now, when it's finished, then I'm ready to invite my readers in and give me suggestions. And one thing I'd say about that is, I think readers, if you have a couple of careful readers, if they tell you something isn't working, especially if two of them tell you, they're probably right. But if they but that's all you need to know. You don't need them to tell you how to fix it, because you'll figure out how to fix it. And maybe they'll say, I think you should fix it this way. Like, your way isn't working. Here's another way I think you should do it. Probably neither of you are right. Your first way is probably wrong, and probably their way is wrong, but there's always a third path. And sometimes hearing that other path will give you an idea for what the correct third path is. So that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, I love that. Love that. There's so much. Yeah, I'm just like taking that in myself, like my own personal self. Okay, we only have about 5 minutes left.
I thought this was an hour-long conversation. It's only half an hour.
Oh,
okay.
just half an hour, sadly.
You sent so many questions. There was no way we were going to get through all those. You're
well,
right.
No, but I always like to have way.
No,
way
it's good
more
to have a lot.
Ever possibly could. Okay, so our last two questions, and you've given us so much advice already, but like, what advice would you give to young writers, particularly to young women that are trying to write, and in this time of like craziness, and there's quarantine, and there's so much going on in the world, like what advice would you give?
One thing I would say is, that's something I said earlier, which is be gentle with yourself and don't let shame take over. I think if you have a doubting voice, which many people do, especially women of all ilk, is oftentimes we have a voice that tells us we shouldn't, or that we're not good enough, or that it's a waste of time. And what I like to say is, I can't keep that voice out of the room, but I can give it a chair in the corner. And I can say, that's going to come in handy later. Like, I'm going to have a character who's going to struggle with those issues, and you are going to come on in at that point. But your job is to sit quietly, and you can have a room. I can't make you leave. You don't have a chair in the room. But right now, I'm going to do this work. The other thing I would say is, find out when you write well. For me, my morning hours are my best. And so that's when I generate creative writing. New stuff is in the morning. Maybe you do your best work after lunch. Figure out what it is, and then don't give that time to something else. If as much as you can, be greedy with your best hours, and use it for generative work. And whatever other duties you have or jobs you have, make them happen in other parts of your day. Yeah, and it's a rough time to write. There's always a reason, though, why it's a rough time to write too. So it can also be a good practice for, if you can do it now, probably you can do it anytime.
Mm-hmm. I just remember, like, right at the beginning of quarantine, there were all those like Twitter memes about like, don't forget Shakespeare wrote King Lear, and it was like, this is not helpful.
Yeah, Shakespeare also had, a staff and a wife to take care of things for him, and most of us don't have all of that support system in place. And Shakespeare had already published a number of plays, right? So Shakespeare was already, like, I've been really prolific during this time, but I have deadlines, and I have people waiting to read my books, and I'm getting paid. And so that makes it a lot easier to produce under pressure, I think, than if you're doing it just because you have a dream. There's no just about a dream, but it makes it harder to write in hard times without that external motivation. So to those people, and if you produce, a beautiful sentence, that's forward progress. If you touch your work today, that's forward progress. You don't have to be everything to be a writer. Pay attention, just be all writers. I think one thing that writers have in common, whether or not we're producing words or not, is that we're noticing things. You have to fill yourself up. So watch the movies, read the books, look outside, open up your brain and just look around, and you have to soak in, to put out.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So collect. You can do that even if you can't write. You can take in a lot right now. There's a lot to see. The world's interesting right now. Terrible and interesting.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. All right, and then my last question, sadly, but what books are you pumped about?
Oh my gosh, the problem here is that I have brought this stack here of like 15 books to share with you, and I don't have time for all of it. I'll just do a few from the top, I guess. I just read A Rather Haunted Life about Shirley Jackson. It's a biography. I thought it was brilliant if you're interested in Shirley Jackson. This is Depart by Sim Kern, a speculative fiction writer living in Houston, Texas. They have stories in several journals. I haven't read this yet, but it's a speculative story about queer refugees, and including someone with trans and Jewish identities who thinks that puts him at risk with certain capital T Texans. And I found this author on the Twitter and became very interested in this book. I haven't read this one yet, but I'm excited. I just read this book, Afro Divided by Ernesto Cisneros. It's a brilliant and beautiful and very sad book about border policies. It's a middle grade novel. This is A Game of Fox and Squirrels. It just came out not too long ago by Jen Reese. It's a book about abuse told through a fantasy world, which you can see why that's sort of my interest. And then I rediscovered this recently. It's one of my favorite books from graduate school. It's called Mrs. Caliban. It's this long, it's a tiny little book, and I absolutely adore Mrs. Caliban by Rachel Ingalls. Oh, and one more, The Only Black Girls in Town by Brandy Colbert is one of my very, very favorite middle grades out this year. And she just has a new book that came out yesterday too, which I ordered but haven't gotten yet, called The Voting Booth. I can't wait to read that. So those are some of the books I would recommend. I've been reading a ton during quarantine too, ordering through bookshop.org. My library hasn't even been open. So it's been, it's a good time to take in, even if you don't have energy to put out. And I am going to be teaching a class. I'm super excited. I'm starting a class on revision. So if you're a writer who wants to hear more about that, you can go to my website, elanakarnold.com, and there's, you can join my newsletter and you'll learn more if you want about, I'll give writing tips in general and also a class that I'm starting up, particularly about revision. So,
ooh, fabulous. Yeah. I would say, do you have any other news quickly before we go, or?
I'm just working on things, but nothing new to report quite yet. Yeah, I do have a middle grade novel coming out, and actually, I guess I do have an early chapter book called Starla Jean that's coming out in January. It's the first in a series about a girl who finds a chicken, based on a real life thing that happened to me and my kid. And then I have a middle grade novel called The House That Wasn't There that comes out in March, at the end of March. I'll be showing the cover of that tomorrow on the Nerdy Book Club if you're Nerdy Book followers. So yeah, that's exciting. I love middle grade.
Exciting. Love it, love it, love it. Okay. So sadly, we are out of time. But thank you so much to everyone for watching and for your questions. And join us next week when Justin will be talking to Francisco X Stork, which will be
you lucky people. I'm going to come listen. Oh, I love Francisco. He is so kind and such a brilliant writer. Yay, Francisco.
Yeah.
Lucky,
we're excited.
You.
We talked to Brandy last week. We're getting talking to
That's
so
wonderful.
many lovely people.
That's
so
wonderful.
Thank you so much again for Elana for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
And viewers, we will see you soon.